Hi again, Captain Peter Cutsey. We're en route to flight level 350 from Muscat to Kuwait. And today's briefing is on encountering turbulence. We're going to be using references directly from our FCOM, our QRH, FCTM, and also again from the FCOM. I've taken all of this information and have put it in a PowerPoint to make it easier for the presentation. We'll go through the PowerPoint first, then we'll go into the airplane at the very end of the presentation and do a sample of encountering severe turbulence in level flight. All right, so let's get started. The FCOM talks about during flight in light, moderate turbulence, the autopilot and or autothrottle may remain engaged unless performance is objectionable. Increased thrust activity can be expected when encountering wind and temperature changes. Short time airspeed excursions of 10 to 15 knots can be expected. All right. So your captain, and we'll discuss with you and with her or his experience, will be able to differentiate and recognize what is light, what is moderate, and what is severe. That comes with experience. We're talking about severe turbulence here. Passenger signs on, yaw damper on, autothrottle disengaged. 3 items. The 4th, autopilot, control wheel steering. The status annunciator, CWS R and P will show. If sustained trimming occurs, disengage the autopilot. Engine start switches, flight, and thrust set. Note, set thrust as needed for the phase of flight. Change thrust setting only if needed to modify an unacceptable speed trend. Now remember, when you go to control wheel steering, this CWS roll and CWS pitch is normal. It's not telling you you have a fault. This is telling you that you are in a different mode that you've selected on the mode control panel. And we'll do that when we go into the airplane. So, and then you actually manually put the aircraft where you want it. You fly an attitude and not an altitude. This comment here, set thrust. Set thrust as needed for the phase of flight, and change thrust only if needed to modify an unacceptable speed trend. All right. Now, here's a look at what the FCOM says. You have basically 3 phases of flight: climb, cruise, and descent. In the climb, speed 280 knots or Mach 0.76, whichever is lower. In cruise, it's different. Use the FMC recommended thrust settings. And we'll actually go and have a quick view at that right now. We'll go to the thrust settings and let you see that. We'll go into the airplane and to the FMC. And we have the FMC here. And here is the recommended thrust setting of 91.9 for a speed of Mach 0.76. In this case, we're going to be using Mach 0.76. And it so happens that our flight plan at our cost index today is calling for Mach 0.76. So we actually, remember, we disengaged the autothrottle. So then when we set thrust, we set 91.9 and leave it. All right, let's go back. So you use FMC recommended. Here they are here. And if the FMC is inoperative, refer to the unreliable airspeed page in the performance in-flight section. All right, so let's go and have a look at that. So the in-flight section for cruise at 60,000 kilos, that's our weight now, is for flight level 350 is recommended setting is 84%. Now these are approximate, remember, okay, to maintain, and a pitch attitude. Well, let's just have a look at what our thrust setting is now and what our pitch attitude is now, just out of curiosity, because we're already at Mach 0.76, aren't we? So let's go and have a boo and have a look at it. Well, we're not quite at 91.9, but we're pretty close in the power setting. And let's have a look at the PFD. Well, here we are at the pitch. Right on the numbers of the pitch, and we're right on the Mach. So you fly the airplane and don't make any changes once you've set the thrust, unless you need to make changes. Let's just go back to the PowerPoint and have a look at what we were talking about there. All right, so in that, we reviewed again, and I like to think in numbers. It's basically 6 things, and do them in groups of 3s. Passenger signs on, the yaw damper should be on, make sure it's on. Auto throttle, disengage, and control wheel steering, push, and we'll actually automatically go from command to control wheel steering, and we'll get this on unseated on the both PFDs. And if sustained trimming occurs, meaning if the turbulence is such and the airspeed changes are such that the autopilot is trimming constantly, disengage the autopilot. Manual flight, hold the attitude, the thrust is set. Engine start switches flight. Now, if you're going to be manually flying, you're going to ask the pilot monitoring to make the selections. And probably recommended, that's called airmanship, that the pilot flying just fly the airplane. So if I'm the pilot flying as a captain, I'm going to say, passenger signs on, yaw damper on. I'm going to monitor the airplane. My pilot monitoring, my first officer will look up and make sure. And then auto throttle disengage. I will disengage the auto throttle. Autopilot, I will take my own autopilot as the pilot flying to CWS. Both of us will actually look for the CWS roll and CWS pitch on our flight on our flight displays, PFDs. And if trimming, sustained trimming occurs, remember, sustained trimming could be a runaway stab. Highly unlikely here because of the moderate turbulence. So you have to be able to differentiate, to recognize and confirm that it's not a runaway stab. And if you're not sure, you disconnect the autopilot, and as a precaution, stab trim come out, cut out to cut out. Go right into the runaway stabilizer procedure if you suspect that. So be very careful about this statement and be able to recognize and confirm what's happening. All right, as pilot flying, call for the pilot monitoring, engine start switches, flight. And as pilot flying will set his own thrust. And remember, set thrust as needed for the phase of flight, change thrust setting only if needed to modify an unacceptable speed trim. Pilot monitoring does this, pilot monitoring does that. Pilot flying does the auto throttle. Pilot flying does his own autopilot. Engine start switches, pilot monitoring, thrust, pilot flying. All right, that is important. We're going to go ahead and do this one soon. Now remember what the FCOM is saying, that use the FMC recommended thrust settings. If the FMC is an operative, we go to the performance as we just did. And remember, the performance will give the approximate N1 settings that maintain near optimum penetration speed. You won't necessarily have Mach 0.76. You could have something close to that. This is important to know. That's why the figures didn't match when we had a look at the airplane. In the descent, which is the third phase of flight, Mach 0.76, 280, or 250, whichever is lower. In red, I've got a little if here. If severe turbulence is encountered at an altitude below 15,000 and the airplane gross weight is less than max landing weight, the airplane may be slowed to 250 knots in the clean configuration. Note, if an approach must be made in an area of severe turbulence, delay flap extension as long as possible. The airplane can withstand higher gust loads in the clean configuration. Going to the airplane. And let's move around the flight deck here. We'll go dynamic. But I've got the sound off as far as the airplane sounds are concerned, because the software will conflict with my voice. All right. Remember, when you, my recommendation is when you're doing items by memory, and remember, this is a supplementary procedure. You don't have time to get the book out and start to look for what are we going to do if we get into severe turbulence. Quite often, you will encounter severe turbulence without any pre-warning. So, know the 6 items by memory. Makes sense. All right. We'll just say here we are, and we start to encounter severe turbulence. Seatbelts on. Yaw damper on. Auto throttle disengage. Control wheel steering selected. Both pilots observe CWS-R and CWS-P on their respective PFDs. Engine start switches. Flight. Engine thrust settings, 91.8 and 1. Set. Now, once you've done this, remember that in control wheel steering, ensure that you keep the attitude. Don't chase the altitude. So I would recommend that you request a block altitude of maybe 2,000 feet, plus or minus, so that you can actually go ahead and be protected in that airspace. It's important that you don't try to maintain an altitude, because the whole idea here is to maintain an attitude until you can get out of the turbulence. And normally, climbing is not a good idea if you're already at a high altitude, because you have more protection at the lower altitudes as far as low speed buffet and high speed buffet. So your experience will dictate what you do. I hope you enjoyed the briefing. This is one of many more supplementary procedures to come in future briefings. Thank you for watching.